On the 9th of December, 2025, as we reach nearly 7 weeks since Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro made his explosive declaration about possessing thousands of Russian anti-aircraft missiles, as the USS Gerald R. Ford carrier strike group continues its menacing presence off Venezuela's coast into what is now the third month of deployment, as American B-52 strategic bombers maintain what the Pentagon euphemistically calls routine patrols in international airspace, but what absolutely everyone understands as barely disguised threats of military action, as approximately 15,000 U.S. troops remain assembled throughout the Caribbean under Operation Southern Spear with no clear exit timeline. The fundamental question that should be dominating every discussion in Washington and throughout the U.S. military establishment is being studiously avoided by officials who desperately don't want to confront uncomfortable realities. Can the United States actually conduct military operations against Venezuela without suffering unacceptable casualties? Back on October 23rd, when Maduro stood before cameras in Caracas with American military power arrayed intimidatingly against his country in the most aggressive display of U.S. force projection in the Western Hemisphere since the Cuban Missile Crisis, he made a statement that Pentagon officials immediately dismissed as propaganda and bluster. He declared that Venezuela possesses 5,000 Igla-S man-portable air defense systems, Russian-made MANPADs deployed at key defensive locations across Venezuelan territory, ready to engage any American aircraft that violates their airspace. 5,000 shoulder-fired anti-aircraft missiles. That's not a token defensive capability. That's not a symbolic deterrent. That's a comprehensive distributed air defense network dense enough to threaten every dimension of American air power, from strategic bombers flying at high altitude to attack helicopters operating at treetop level to the transport aircraft that would be essential for bringing in troops and supplies for any ground operation. But here's what should terrify Pentagon planners as we approach mid-December with Operation Southern Spear showing no signs of winding down, and Trump administration officials escalating rather than moderating their regime change rhetoric. Intelligence assessments conducted over the past 6 weeks have confirmed that Maduro wasn't exaggerating, that Venezuela has indeed assembled exactly what he claimed, and that in combination with other Russian-supplied systems deployed throughout October and November, Venezuela now possesses a multi-layered integrated air defense grid that represents a genuine, credible, potentially catastrophic threat to American air operations. If you think I'm overstating the danger, if you believe Venezuela couldn't possibly pose serious risks to U.S. military superiority, if you're confident that American technology and training would easily overwhelm whatever defenses Venezuela has assembled with Russian help, let me walk you through exactly what has been deployed over the past 2 months, what it means operationally for the types of missions U.S. forces would need to conduct, and why American air power is genuinely threatened in ways that fundamentally challenge 4 decades of assumptions about American military dominance in our own hemisphere. I've spent 40 years studying air defense systems, analyzing asymmetric warfare, tracking Russian arms exports, and understanding how modern integrated air defense networks actually function when confronted with technologically superior adversaries. And I can tell you with absolute certainty, based on what Venezuela has deployed since October, that this is not propaganda, not empty deterrent posturing, but a credible capability that could inflict casualties on American forces at levels that would be politically catastrophic and strategically unacceptable. Let me walk you through the detailed timeline of what Russia delivered to Venezuela over the past 2 months, how these systems integrate to create overlapping threat envelopes, why this matters specifically for American operational planning, what it reveals about Russian strategy in directly challenging U.S. power in the Western Hemisphere, and most critically, why the comfortable assumptions that have guided American military planning for decades are dangerously obsolete when confronting what Venezuela has built. Because understanding Venezuela's defensive capabilities as they exist today in December 2025 isn't academic military analysis, it's essential to evaluating whether American threats of intervention are credible, or whether Washington is bluffing with a hand that can't actually win without paying costs that no administration could sustain politically. But first, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from, because what happens in Venezuela over the next weeks and months will determine whether American military power retains its deterrent credibility globally, or whether we're about to learn painful lessons about the limits of technological superiority against determined adversaries with modern Russian equipment. Here's the narrative that Pentagon briefers and Trump administration officials have been desperately trying to maintain throughout Operation Southern Spear, the story they absolutely need the American public and Congress to believe, because acknowledging the alternative would require admitting that their aggressive posture toward Venezuela may have backed them into a corner with no good options. Venezuela under Maduro is a failing narco state, militarily weak, technologically backward, surviving only through repression and the support of Cuban advisors and Russian arms merchants looking to make money selling obsolete equipment. Their armed forces are demoralized, poorly trained, equipped with aging Soviet-era systems from the 1970s and 1980s that have been inadequately maintained due to economic collapse and sanctions. Venezuelan military personnel lack the technical expertise to operate complex air defense systems effectively, even if the equipment itself were capable, which it largely isn't after decades of neglect. Their radars are antiquated and easily defeated by modern American electronic warfare capabilities that the U.S. has refined through decades of operations. Their missile systems, whatever vintage they may be, suffer from age-related degradation, lack of spare parts due to international sanctions, and the systemic corruption that characterizes everything in Maduro's Venezuela. The notion that Venezuela could pose any meaningful threat to American air power, the most technologically advanced and operationally experienced air force in human history, is fundamentally absurd. The United States military operates F-35 stealth fighters that are essentially invisible to legacy air defense radars, F-22 air superiority fighters that would dominate any contested airspace within hours, B-52 and B-2 bombers capable of striking from standoff ranges with precision-guided munitions that Venezuelan defenses couldn't even detect, let alone intercept, sophisticated EA-18G Growler electronic warfare aircraft that can blind and confuse enemy defensive systems, plus decades of institutional knowledge conducting suppression of enemy air defense missions perfected through operations in Iraq, Serbia, Libya, and Syria. American pilots train constantly against realistic threats at red flag exercises using the most sophisticated simulators in existence. American doctrine for defeating integrated air defenses has been proven and refined through multiple conflicts against adversaries who were far more capable than Venezuela. If the United States decided to conduct military operations against Venezuela, establishing air superiority would take hours, destroying critical defensive nodes would happen within the first 24 hours, and American aircraft would operate with near total impunity thereafter. Maduro's claims back in October about possessing thousands of missiles and comprehensive air defense capabilities were transparent propaganda designed to deter intervention by creating the illusion of defensive capability that doesn't actually exist in any operationally meaningful sense. When confronted with real American military power rather than rhetorical threats, Venezuelan defenses would collapse rapidly. Their personnel would flee or surrender. Their systems would be destroyed or captured, exactly as happened with Saddam Hussein's supposedly formidable integrated air defense network in 1991 and again in 2003, exactly as Gaddafi's air defenses disintegrated in 2011 when NATO decided to intervene in Libya. There's no reason whatsoever to take Venezuelan defensive boasts seriously, no cause for concern about American casualties or operational complications. No justification for hesitation if Washington decides that removing Maduro serves American interests. This is the narrative coming from defense officials briefing Congress, from Trump administration spokespeople justifying Operation Southern Spear's continued deployment, from military officers whose entire careers have been built on the unquestioned assumption of American air dominance. It's politically convenient, psychologically comforting, and operationally reassuring. It's also catastrophically disconnected from the reality of what Venezuela has actually deployed over the past 2 months with comprehensive Russian assistance. Let me systematically dismantle this dangerous fiction by walking you through the detailed timeline of exactly what Russia has delivered to Venezuela since October, because the accumulation of capabilities over just these past 6 to 8 weeks has fundamentally transformed Venezuela's defensive posture in ways that American officials either don't understand or are deliberately concealing from public scrutiny. Start with Maduro's October 23rd statement, which at the time was dismissed by Pentagon spokespeople as exaggeration and propaganda. He claimed Venezuela possessed 5,000 Igla-S manned portable air defense systems. The Igla-S, designated SA-24 Grinch by NATO, is not some obsolete Cold War relic. This is a fourth-generation MANPAD system that Russia introduced into service in 2004, represents the cutting edge of shoulder-fired anti-aircraft technology, and has been selectively exported only to countries that Russia considers strategically important partners. The Igla-S features an advanced infrared seeker that is highly resistant to modern countermeasures, including flares and infrared jammers, has a maximum range of 6 kilometers and maximum altitude of 3.5 kilometers, can engage targets at any aspect angle, including head-on intercepts that earlier generation MANPADs couldn't effectively accomplish, and has been proven in combat in Syria, where Igla-S systems successfully shot down various aircraft types, including modern helicopters and jets operated by government and opposition forces. These are not symbolic weapons. These are credible systems that pose genuine threats to any aircraft operating at low to medium altitude. Now, the 5,000 number that Maduro cited sounded absurd to American ears. For context, the United States provided roughly 2,000 Stinger MANPADs to Ukraine over the first 2 years of that war, and those 2,000 Stingers have been credited with destroying hundreds of Russian helicopters and fixed-wing aircraft, fundamentally altering air war dynamics and preventing Russia from achieving air superiority over Ukrainian territory. Venezuela claiming to possess more than twice that number of comparable Russian systems seemed like obvious exaggeration designed for propaganda effect. Except here's what intelligence assessments conducted throughout November have confirmed. Maduro wasn't exaggerating. Russia has been quietly supplying Venezuela with massive quantities of Igla-S systems for over a year, accelerating deliveries dramatically throughout 2025 as tensions with the United States escalated. The 5,000 figure appears to be accurate or very close to accurate based on satellite imagery of Venezuelan military facilities showing stockpiles consistent with that inventory level, signals intelligence tracking Russian cargo flights into Venezuela, and human intelligence from sources within Venezuelan military logistics networks. Venezuela genuinely has 5,000 or close to 5,000 Igla-S MANPADs. That is an absolutely extraordinary number that creates operational challenges for American air power that Pentagon planners may not have fully grasped. Understand what 5,000 dispersed MANPAD systems mean tactically. You cannot destroy them through airstrikes because they're man-portable, easily concealed, rapidly relocated, operated by small teams that can hide in forests, buildings, mountainous terrain across Venezuela's diverse geography. You can destroy a fixed radar installation with a cruise missile launched from 200 miles away. You can target a SAM battery position with a HARM anti-radiation missile that homes in on radar emissions. But you cannot effectively target individual soldiers carrying shoulder-fired missiles who remain hidden until American aircraft come within engagement range. MANPADs create a distributed, persistent, nearly impossible to suppress threat that forces American aircraft to make impossible choices. Fly at low altitude to stay under medium and long-range SAM coverage. You're in the MANPAD kill zone where thousands of Igla-S operators could be waiting anywhere. That means attack helicopters like Apache, which would be absolutely essential for any ground operation to provide fire support and mobility, become extremely vulnerable. Close air support aircraft like A-10 Warthog or AC-130 gunship cannot safely operate at the low altitudes where they're most effective. Even transport aircraft like C-130 or helicopters conducting insertion or extraction operations have to accept enormous risk flying through Venezuelan airspace saturated with 5,000 shoulder-fired missiles. But the MANPADs, as threatening as they are, represent only the lowest altitude layer of Venezuela's air defense network. Throughout October and November, Russia delivered multiple additional air defense systems that create overlapping threat envelopes across different altitude regimes, and this is where Venezuela's defensive posture becomes genuinely formidable rather than merely challenging. On October 23rd, the same day as Maduro's announcement about MANPADs, Venezuelan forces deployed Russian Buk M2E medium-range air defense systems to positions near the coast and around strategic locations, including Caracas, specifically in response to American B-52 bomber flights that had been approaching Venezuelan airspace. The Buk M2E is a highly capable system able to engage targets at ranges up to 48 kilometers, that's roughly 30 miles, and altitudes up to 80,000 feet. The system can simultaneously track dozens of targets using advanced radar and can engage multiple targets at once. This is the same Buk family that shot down Malaysia Airlines Flight 17 over eastern Ukraine in 2014, definitively proving that Buk systems are absolutely capable of destroying large aircraft at high altitude. Against military targets, the Buk M2E is specifically designed to engage fighter aircraft, bombers, cruise missiles, helicopters, and even some categories of tactical ballistic missiles. For American operational planners looking at potential strikes against Venezuela, the presence of Buk systems means that aircraft operating at medium altitudes, roughly 15,000 to 50,000 feet, are at significant risk. Those B-52 bombers that have been conducting patrols near Venezuelan airspace, they're large, non-stealthy, relatively slow targets that would be priority targets for Buk batteries. Even more modern aircraft would need to either fly complex evasive routes, deploy comprehensive electronic countermeasures, conduct dangerous suppression missions against the Buk batteries themselves, or launch weapons from standoff ranges outside the Buk engagement envelope, which limits weapon types and effectiveness. Then in early November, Russia delivered Tor M2E short to medium-range air defense systems to Venezuela via Il-76 transport aircraft, in what Russian officials described as defensive assistance to a sovereign nation facing external threats. The Tor system is particularly sophisticated, mounted on tracked vehicles for high mobility, featuring a phased array radar that is extremely difficult to jam using conventional electronic warfare techniques capable of simultaneously tracking 48 targets while engaging 4 at once. But here's what makes the Tor system especially problematic for American operational planning. The Tor is specifically designed and optimized to defend high-value assets against precision-guided weapons, cruise missiles, and critically, anti-radiation missiles. When American forces conduct SEAD operations, suppression of enemy air defenses, the standard tactic is to fire AGM-88 HARM missiles that home in on enemy radar emissions and destroy the radar systems, blinding the air defense network. The Tor system is specifically engineered to detect and shoot down incoming HARMs before they reach their targets. This creates a serious tactical dilemma for American mission planners. If Venezuelan Tor systems can successfully intercept the anti-radiation missiles designed to kill Venezuelan air defense radars, then American aircraft have to either get much closer to attack with shorter range weapons, exposing themselves to greater risk, or accept that Venezuelan air defenses may remain operational throughout an air campaign rather than being rapidly suppressed in the opening hours as American doctrine assumes. Moving to the upper end of Venezuela's air defense architecture, the country possesses S-300 VM systems, also known as Ante-2500, that Russia delivered years ago, but that Russian technicians have been maintaining and upgrading throughout 2025. These are long-range strategic air defense systems capable of engaging targets at ranges exceeding 160 kilometers, roughly 100 miles, and at extremely high altitudes. The S-300 VM was originally designed to counter theater ballistic missiles, but it's also highly effective against aircraft, including strategic bombers, aerial refueling tankers, and AWACS airborne early warning aircraft. This system creates an area denial bubble over much of northern Venezuela and into Venezuelan territorial waters. American aircraft operating within that bubble, particularly high-value enabling assets like AWACS planes that coordinate air operations, KC-135 or KC-46, aerial refueling tankers that extend aircraft range and loiter time, even B-52 bombers conducting standoff strikes, all face genuine risk from S-300 VM engagement. American planners would need to either operate these critical assets outside the S-300 engagement envelope, significantly reducing their effectiveness and aircraft operational range, or accept substantial risk to platforms that are expensive, difficult to replace, and carry large crews. Most recently, in early November, Russia delivered Pantsir S-1 systems to Venezuela, and this is where the situation becomes not just militarily challenging, but potentially escalatory in ways that could trigger great power confrontation. The Pantsir S-1 is a unique air defense system combining surface-to-air missiles with radar-guided anti-aircraft autocannons, designed specifically as a point defense system, protecting high-value targets from aircraft, helicopters, cruise missiles, and precision-guided munitions that penetrate through outer defensive layers. The Pantsir is highly mobile, quick to deploy, effective at short ranges, and represents the last line of defense when everything else has failed. But here's what makes the Pantsir deliveries particularly concerning beyond their tactical capability. Multiple intelligence sources and analysts have reported strong suspicions backed by circumstantial evidence, including the speed of deployment and the sophistication of operational employment, that Russian military personnel may be directly operating some of these Pantsir systems rather than merely training Venezuelans to use them. If Russian military personnel, whether formally acknowledged Russian armed forces members or technically private contractors, are actually manning air defense systems in Venezuela, and if those systems engage American aircraft during any military operation, Americans would potentially be killing Russians in direct combat. How does that escalate? Does Russia respond in Venezuela? Do they respond elsewhere, perhaps in Syria, where small numbers of American forces remain vulnerable, or in some other theater where Russian and American interests collide? Does this become the spark for direct U.S.-Russia military confrontation that both sides have carefully avoided for decades? These aren't theoretical questions. These are real escalation dynamics that could transform what Washington imagines as a limited regional intervention into a great power crisis with potentially catastrophic consequences. Now, let me explain why Venezuela's multi-layered air defense network creates such profound operational problems for American military planning, because it's not simply about having capable individual systems. It's about how these systems integrate to create overlapping threat envelopes that force American planners into impossible trade-offs at every altitude regime. Imagine you're an American mission planner at Southern Command tasked with developing strike packages against targets in Venezuela. You immediately face dilemmas that have no clean solutions. If you plan to fly low, below 5,000 feet, to avoid medium and long-range SAM systems, you're flying directly into the MANPAD envelope where 5,000 Igla-S missiles could be positioned anywhere along your flight path, operated by small teams that you cannot detect until they fire, creating persistent threat throughout your entire mission profile. Flying low also means you're vulnerable to Venezuelan anti-aircraft artillery and short-range systems. Your aircraft are working harder, burning more fuel-reducing range and loiter time, and you're more vulnerable to ground fire and small arms if you're conducting close air support. If you decide instead to fly at medium altitude, say 15,000 to 30,000 feet, to get above the MANPAD and middle-way threat, you're now in the engagement envelope of Venezuela's Buk M2E and Tor M2E systems, positioned around likely target areas and approach routes. These are modern systems with capable radars and operators who have been training specifically for this scenario. Some of your aircraft will be engaged, some will be hit, crews will be lost. If you fly high above 30,000 feet to avoid medium-range threats, you're in S-300 VM range, and effectiveness at hitting ground targets decreases dramatically with altitude. You can't conduct close air support from 40,000 feet. You can't provide effective reconnaissance. You can't insert special forces or conduct personnel recovery. High-altitude tactics work for strategic bombing with precision-guided weapons, but don't support the full spectrum of operations that military intervention would require. Modern American doctrine tries to resolve these dilemmas through several approaches, and I need to explain why each approach has serious limitations when applied against Venezuela's defenses as they currently exist in December 2025. First approach used stealth aircraft, specifically F-35 Lightning II, to penetrate Venezuelan airspace because stealth design makes them difficult for enemy radars to detect and track. Stealth absolutely helps, but it's not invisibility, and it's not a panacea. F-35 is optimized to be stealthy against X-band radars typically used by fighter aircraft and many SAM systems. But Russian air defense networks increasingly employ multiple radar types, including very high frequency and ultra high frequency radars that can detect stealth aircraft at reduced but still operationally relevant ranges. If Venezuela's S-300 VM operators use VHF radar, they might detect F-35s at 50 or 70 kilometers rather than at 150 kilometers. Reduced detection range, yes, but still sufficient to cue other sensors and weapons to the approximate location. Once you know roughly where a stealth aircraft is operating, you can employ other sensors, including infrared search and track. You can concentrate multiple radar types to narrow the search volume. You can position shorter range systems to ambush likely ingress and egress routes. Stealth provides advantage, but not immunity. Additionally, F-35 has significant limitations. To maintain stealth profile, weapons must be carried internally, which severely limits payload. An F-35 carrying weapons internally can carry perhaps 4 air-to-ground weapons. A conventional F-15E carrying weapons on external pylons can carry 20 or more weapons. If you need to hit many targets, you need many F-35 sorties, which means more aircraft exposure, more opportunities for something to go wrong. F-35s are also expensive to operate, limited in total fleet numbers, and there are never enough to do everything simultaneously. Second approach, use standoff weapons launched from outside Venezuelan air defense range. B-52 bombers can launch cruise missiles from 100 miles offshore. Ships can launch Tomahawks from the Caribbean, never entering defended airspace. This works for hitting fixed targets, command bunkers, government buildings, known radar positions, but standoff strikes cannot provide close air support for ground troops, cannot conduct dynamic targeting against mobile forces, cannot suppress air defenses that move after being attacked, cannot insert personnel or provide combat search and rescue for downed pilots. Standoff strikes are one tool, but cannot substitute for the full range of air operations that military intervention requires. Additionally, Venezuela's Tor and Pantsir systems are specifically designed to intercept cruise missiles. If you're firing Tomahawks at defended targets, you need to fire enough to saturate defenses, overwhelming their capacity to intercept. Third approach, conduct comprehensive SAD campaigns, suppression of enemy air defenses, where specialized aircraft attack Venezuelan air defense systems to clear the way for other aircraft. This is core American doctrine refined over decades, but SAD is inherently dangerous, requiring aircraft to deliberately expose themselves to threats in order to locate and attack defensive systems. The whole concept of SAD is accepting risk to eliminate threats for follow-on forces. Against adversaries with modern integrated air defenses, including Tor systems designed to shoot down anti-radiation missiles, SAD becomes extraordinarily dangerous. You're flying aircraft into defended airspace, hoping that when you fire harms at enemy radars, your missile gets there before their missile gets to you. And if they have systems specifically designed to intercept your harms, you're now in a very dangerous shooting match. American doctrine assumes SAD works because it has worked historically against adversaries with older equipment, poor integration, inadequate training. Venezuela, with modern Russian systems operated by personnel trained by Russian advisors, possibly with Russian contractors directly involved, represents a much more challenging problem than Iraq 1991 or Serbia 1999. Fourth approach, use electronic warfare to jam Venezuelan radars and communications, preventing them from effectively tracking and engaging American aircraft. EA-18G. Growler electronic warfare aircraft are highly capable, and electronic attack is a key component of American air operations. But it's an ongoing technological